I never felt pressure from my parents in terms of choosing a career path. Originally, when I had graduated from the University of Central Florida, I was planning on going to law school. Actually, I was an economics major, and my life totally changed after I graduated because I ended up realizing that that was not actually a career or a job that I wanted to do, and I ended up hitting a point of almost like a crisis because I realized, oh, I just spent all this time at university, got my degree, and now this isn't actually what I want to do. Do I continue with it? And that's when my mother, she said, hey, why don't you follow me under my business and learn with me? And I was able to do that for a few years through the pandemic and was able to learn a lot from her. And finally, I realized that it was time for a new challenge. And so I was referred by a friend into the semiconductor industry. And from that point on, I just really embraced it with open arms. And it's been an incredible just experience being in this industry so far. And I'm excited to talk about it more.
The JobGuppy podcast is on a mission to help career explorers and job seekers find out from real people what a specific career or job is really like on a day-to-day basis. Join me, your host, Chris Hodges, as we dive in and explore jobs with each guest. You'll hear from experienced working professionals with transparent, realistic, and job-specific insight about the daily roles and their career journey. We go on to explore other topics like job search recommendations and income and salaries. You'll hear answers to questions like, do I need to go to college for this job? How much college? What is your work-life balance like? What do you like or dislike, or what would you do different? And if you don't like what you hear about one job role, we discuss alternative job titles to explore related to the same industry. And my favorite part is the end where the guest shares their inspirational insight and recommendations for the next person wanting to get started on their career journey. Hey everyone, this episode dives into the role of an IC layout engineer in the semiconductor industry. An IC layout engineer plans, routes, and creates all the connections and interconnects between circuits in a semiconductor chip. Harrison joins us today and tells us how he got involved in this career field, and he shares his guidance to anyone else wanting to do the same. It turns out this is a great job that requires some education, but not necessarily college, and it can have high earning potential fairly quickly too. Enjoy this episode, and then check out the JobGuppy website for notes from Harrison's interview, like links to the Silicon Drafting Institute and other educational resources, example job searches, and key takeaways.
My name is Harrison. I was born in Orlando, Florida, to two amazing parents. They both immigrated from Vietnam, came over to the States here in the 80s, and eventually moved to Florida in the 90s. They actually had their honeymoon over at Disney World, and they thought Orlando would be a nice place to raise a family. My mother has been an entrepreneur pretty much her whole life. She's always had that spirit for business. And growing up, she was in the nail salon and spa industry. And so being around her and seeing the way that she conducted herself doing business was something that I always really admired. And I knew that being around her just was such a positive influence. My dad, on the other hand, he is a professional musician, recording engineer, a songwriter. He, within my family dynamic, is definitely the more fun and jovial side, while my mom is the, boss. Businesswoman. So growing up in that environment, I definitely would say that helped shape me who I am. And I never felt pressure from my parents in terms of choosing a career path. Originally, when I had graduated from the University of Central Florida, I was planning on going to law school. Actually, I was an economics major, and my life totally changed after I graduated because I ended up realizing that that was not actually a career or a job that I wanted to do. And I ended up hitting a point of almost like a crisis because I realized, oh, I just spent all this time at university, got my degree, and now this isn't actually what I want to do. Do I continue with it? And that's when my mother, she said, hey, why don't you follow me under my business and learn with me? And I was able to do that for a few years through the pandemic and was able to learn a lot from her. And finally, I realized that it was time for a new challenge. And so I was referred by a friend into the semiconductor industry. And from that point on, I just really embraced it with open arms. And it's been an incredible just experience being in this industry so far. And I'm excited to talk about it more.
All right. Great introduction there. Shout out to your parents too. That's cool. So jumping into the job role, the way I like to kind of start the specifics of your role, and You saw the interview script, so you probably know as we'll touch on different things as we go through, but just jumping right into the role of the IC layout. If you were sitting with someone, just starting their career, high school, trade school, college graduate, do you think they would know about the job you're interviewing and, to hire them for? And then how would you describe, what you do to them?
I would say unless that individual maybe has an EE degree, then they possibly could know about layout. But this space in particular, in my opinion, is very niche. And a lot of the learning that is needed for this role is also very niche in terms of where you can learn. There's not that many schools or programs that offer this type of education. And so, for example, the folks that I work with, they were all original members that had worked in the fab previously and were just able to pick up more of these skills along the way from others. Nowadays, there's definitely programs where you could learn from. But to just discuss about what the role is, basically, I'm using a computer aided design tool called Cadence. There's a couple other tools that you could use, but for my job, I use a tool called Cadence, and I'm delivered schematics that have designs on how to build specific circuits. And my role is to lay out and build the circuit and lay out these models that are presented to me. And we do this through digital circuits or analog circuits. And through that process, you verify it using different tools and making sure that it follows the specific design rules, and also making sure that it also follows the schematic. But I always like to tell people, because they ask me, especially some friends, they say, Harrison, what do you actually do for work? And the biggest analogy that I could give is basically there is a customer that wants to build a home. They hire an architect. They say, hey, I want to build this home, but I only have this specific amount of lot or acres to build on. The architect then is able to lay everything down. They then hand that piece of paper over to a general contractor. And I would kind of have a parallel between a general contractor and a layout designer. So we are in charge of building out the schematic provided by that architect.
Wow, that's actually pretty neat. I have tried to phrase IC layout stuff to people just since I'm an electrical engineer. I do have kind of a grasp of what you're talking about, but I've never thought of it that way. That's a pretty excellent way to talk about it as form of a house, because that's what you're doing. I'll have some questions there. I hear stuff about engineering. I hear you're getting circuits. Do you have to have a hardcore electrical engineering background?
Yeah, so I guess I could preface by saying that, I never went to school for engineering. I have no engineering background. I had absolutely no idea what an integrated circuit was, or even that much about electronics. But going to, school and learning the theory behind electronics, behind integrated circuits, you definitely have to have an understanding of the theory, because that's going to play a huge role in the way that you do your layout.
And did you pick this up while you were doing IC layout training, or you picked this up after you did the IC layout training and started working, and then you started grasping onto the fundamentals?
So at the program that I went to, it's called Silicon Drafting Institute. It was out in San Jose, California. I didn't start touching any type of layout until probably a month into the program. The first month is just to give you a preliminary foundation on understanding integrated circuits, electronics. I remember my first lesson on a transistor, and it's very important to learn those things, how to see specific devices in parallel or series, all the different devices, and NORs, ORs, regular inverters, complex logics, a lot of the theory things on the design aspect. But you also get into a lot of theory on electromigration and analog matching and all these other things too. So it's definitely very important that you have that knowledge, because without it, it would make doing layout a lot more difficult and arduous.
And so on your time breakdown, there's some assumptions here that you're just sitting at your desk all day working on IC layout, but I don't want to, that's the whole purpose of this, is to see if those assumptions hold true, or I have assumptions other people may not.
Yeah. So basically, I'm in the office 3 days a week. At my company, they allow us to have a hybrid schedule, and I'm working along with other team members. I would say being in this environment of doing layout, you definitely need to have great team skills because you are working alongside other layout designers as well. And just to harpen back on that analogy that I gave about general contractors, it's tough for one person to build an entire house. You're going to need your plumbers, the people doing HVAC, the concrete person. And the communication is very important because you're working alongside these blocks that have so many different layers and hierarchical levels that the communication amongst team members is really important. As far as like a daily schedule, weekly schedule for myself, we do have a lot of team meetings, and these meetings are also with different members of the design process. So it's a very like almost symbiotic relationship between us and the design team. The circuit engineers, they're the ones that are constantly running simulation and doing revisions, letting us know what new designs that they have. And for us doing our job, we're always the one that is providing feedback. Maybe we let the design team know that, hey, perhaps we could do this a specific way, save a little bit more space. And with the technology that we're working with nowadays, everything is just so small, and we're trying to fit in as much devices as we can for power and efficiency and speed. And yeah, so a lot of team meetings to discuss these things. And other than that, like you said earlier, a lot of it is also sitting and doing the actual work aspect.
Would you say percentage wise, half your time is interacting with people and then half your time is alone, or maybe 10% one and 90% the other?
While you're doing your actual job, you're not necessarily interacting. However, within my company, the space that is kind of curated, everyone is always talking all the time, bouncing ideas off one another because we're all working in the same space relatively. And so when you're actually doing a work within a specific block or cell that's assigned to you, or if you're a lead of a specific section, you're doing that work on your own. But throughout the day, we're always constantly talking and sharing ideas.
One big question I like to ask, and I think this is kind of important for folks listening to it, the target audience, is a lot of them are trying to figure out, like, how do I even know what I want to do? So how did you know that this is what you wanted to do? And I guess you already shared your career path, but if you would like to maybe go back through that or touch on any highlights of it from kind of when you got out of school to how you migrated into this. But that big part of that is, how did you know this is what you wanted to do?
Yeah, so I did work for my mother and her business, and it was a great opportunity. I was able to learn so much about entrepreneurship as well as what it takes to run a successful business. And, during the time of COVID as well, that was a tough experience for my family. And I initially wanted to go back to school prior to that. But because of the pandemic, I wanted to make sure that everything was well and that the business was back up and running and functioning great. And so after when the pandemic had started to settle down a little bit, I realized that I wanted to go back to school. And I knew that I wanted to challenge myself, and I knew that I wanted to just learn something new, but I had absolutely no idea what that was going to be. I just was very lucky because my uncle had a friend that he reached out to, and that individual reached out to me, and we were able to get on a call. And he said, I heard you're wanting to go back to school. Do you know anything about integrated circuits and layout? And I said, that sounds way too above my pay grade. I have no idea what you're talking about. But he said, let me dumb it down for you. Do you like to play video games? And how good are you at Tetris? And I told him that I was pretty good at Tetris. That was pretty much kind of the introduction to what the job actually entailed. And through that experience, I was able to get a recommendation from him to go to this layout school. And that's something that I actually really wanted to touch on because within this industry, it's very difficult to pick up this particular skill of being able to do layout and to learn it. It does take some time, but with the right guidance, it's something that anybody could do. As long as you enjoy learning and you have a fascination with just wanting to experience something new, the job itself is actually extremely fun. And I feel also very lucky to have entered into the program that I have because they made it very engaging and also extremely just interesting to learn.
Nice. That's pretty crazy that it was just literally a phone call that you had that kicked the wheels in motion. It wasn't like you were Googling and looking for stuff and said, this looks interesting. Let me go find out how to do it. I guess what I'm taking away from that is that you had the initiative to, and the openness that you were open and you had the initiative to get on the phone, talk to somebody, listen to what they had to say, receive it. And, you had to decide if that was something that interested you based on what you heard, but it checked something off in you that you decided, yeah, that sounds kind of interesting. So, it could have been I guess a different business, a different topic if you had talked to somebody else, but it happened to be IC layout, so it sounds like it's a successful story. Is there a particular industry you're in? We just mentioned IC layout. I already know what that means because I'm in the industry, but for someone listening, let's kind of back it up just one more step before we get too far away from the specific job details of, this is the semiconductor industry. Is that safe to say?
That's right.
So, you're working for companies that basically design semiconductor components. There's lots of companies. I'll name some big ones like, Intel, AMD, Broadcom. Facebook makes chips. Microsoft has people at Amazon makes semiconductor chips. And so people with your skill set could potentially work at any of these companies that are basically creating these chips, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad we touched on that because I think we bypassed that in the beginning, and I was already in there with you. So it's like I got to back it up some and like paint the big picture where this person fits in, in life, in the whole job market. So is there anything about your job you think would surprise people to know?
Yes. Oh my gosh, where do I even begin? Well, so the company that I work at, Micron, we specifically are creating memory chips. And right now there's a huge wave of AI, and with memory in particular, you need a lot of data centers for those things. And so memory chips are needed, but memory chips are also needed for so many different other functions, automobile, compute. But what I will say, which is something that blows my mind every time I think about it, is these microchips are just so small. And right now, the latest microchips, the newest technology is 2 nanometers, which is the same width as a strand of human DNA. Just to give an example, Apple's latest MacBooks that they have come out with, they're using these new chips called M chips. And the MacBooks are absolutely great, so fast, efficient. These chips that are powering these devices are 2 nanometers, and to be able to fit billions of transistors in them, like just to use the analogy of building that house again, could you imagine just filling in a billion pieces of furniture in the house? Like, it's just so tough to even grasp your mind around these numbers. And
I'll circle back to the education part of that, but it sounds like there's a pretty, I would say, relatively fast entry level compared to somebody going for like a 4 or 6 year degree. That sounds, what's kind of surprising to me of the entry level that you could jump in on this and get your hands dirty. Like, you were in there, and sounds like within 6 months you were probably getting your hands dirty on something and working with some level of layout, right?
yeah, and I mean, the folks that I work with that do have electrical engineering degrees, they all went to Boise State, and Boise State is one of the few universities that actually kind of offer any type of layout class that you could take for credits. And through that experience, you start learning a little bit about how to use the Cadence tools and how to do layout. But from the actual program, it's a very quick turnaround. I mean, I joined in the program, and on average, I would say most students take about 8 months to complete the program. And by that point, you can start interviewing with companies, and then you're just completely thrusted into it because you learn how to do layout and you have the education on your theory enough so that you could talk to circuit designers, because the role that you have is absolutely crucial to make their vision come true. I would say compared to many other career paths, it's a very quick education process, but that is what makes it so fun. I loved that I could learn a new skill and further my education, but be able to kind of propel myself into a career relatively quickly.
What about your job do you like or do you dislike?
The best part about my job is it truly feels like I'm playing video games every day. It's always really engaging, and I always think to myself that I'm just one additional step in the process of this incredible technology being made, and it feels really good that I could play a hand in doing that. But using that example as well, what's really interesting is, like, even though you're playing the same game every day, the rules of the game could also change every day. And that is a good and a bad thing. It keeps things fresh and fun, but it also is frustrating sometimes when you are doing your layout, you're doing your work, you're building so many blocks and going through the entire hierarchy, and you're really invested in your work. But then all of a sudden, design comes in and says, hey, you know what? I don't think this is going to work for power or speed. We're going to scratch the whole thing, flip all of it around. And the beautiful house you just built maybe now is totally rearranged. So I would say that is definitely an aspect that I think all layout designers can get a little frustrated on them. But that also goes to show that throughout doing your work in this industry, sometimes it's not the best to fall in love too much with what you're doing.
Good point. How would you describe your work-life balance?
Yeah, I would say I'm very blessed. I love the company that I work at because they do a great job of prioritizing teamwork and also just people in general. I think for us as well, we also have the resources where we have enough team members to be able to keep the ball rolling on projects. And so where I work, 40 hours is the standard work week. And, unless you are at a very high level position where you're a block lead for the entire project, then for somebody that's an E1 or an E2, even some senior level E3s, like you're primarily working 40 hours and then you don't really have to think about much outside of that. And so I would say for work-life balance for me in particular, I think it's great. I do know within this industry, depending on some companies that you're also with as well, they may be a little bit less resource heavy. And so the work that you have to do sometimes can be very time dependent. And with that, there's a lot of additional hours that you would have to work. And this is pretty standard throughout the industry. Anytime we get close to tape out, it's all hands on deck at that point. And those 40-hour work weeks are no longer a thing, but those are also really fun and exciting times as well. And there's nothing better than making it through a tape out, especially with the people that you work with. It's a huge accomplishment and really rewarding feeling.
I do believe in the electrical engineering degree world, at least in semiconductor. This is pretty well known for the listeners that things are cyclical. You're going to have some peaks, but it's not always like that. When you interview, you try to talk to people about what is that work-life balance like at that company, because as you mentioned, they might be a little resource constrained. And so when you're talking about the work-life balance in your interview and you're asking that question, hoping they're being honest with you about it, because they're not being transparent. They tell you it's great, don't worry about it, and you go work there and it's really bad, you're probably going to quit. It's hurting you and it's hurting them because they got to go back through the whole process again. So when I've interviewed people, I've always been very transparent about expectations and leave it up to them to decide. I'm not trying to hire somebody just because I want a person here. I want somebody that will fit in with the role we have, the time we need, things like that. So your perspective and then what you elaborated on as an industry, I think the listener would, the takeaway there would be to ask those questions in an interview and ask about how many resources are used, how much time do they spend, how quickly do those cycles come. If they're happening every month, that's not good. If they're happening every 3 months, maybe I can handle it. That's up to the person interviewing. That's a good description of the work-life balance. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and thank you for being transparent for those individuals that you talk to. I feel like that's definitely really needed nowadays more than ever. Everyone's time is extremely valuable. So for you to be transparent during that process that's wonderful. Thank you.
Looking at the official names of your role, is there anything unique or something that sets you apart in your role compared to the norm?
The thing about this role is it's a very creative role. And the most beautiful thing about layout design is every artist paints something different, has different techniques, different ways of thinking, a different vision on how you want to lay out the design, how you want to build your blocks, how do you want to connect them all together. And for me personally, I'm very confident in the way that I can envision doing floor planning and also building out the block. Where do certain nets hook up with each other? How are the buses looking for power and supply? But I would say just out of the actual job role, because everybody is so creative, it makes everybody special in that way. Like for the team that I work at, everybody is just so great at a particular thing about designing their layout that is only for them, that it makes it, one of a kind, essentially.
Great answer. Moving into your job role relative to others in your field, what are the official names of some other roles if somebody wanted to look for different kinds of jobs in the semiconductor field?
Yeah, so the overall broad description is IC layout, but as far as role names, layout designer, I would not call myself an engineer because I don't have an engineering degree. But for those that are in, for example, within my company that do have a degree, they're known as layout engineers. So that's something that a person could also look up if you have an engineering degree. There's also layout mask designer. The reason the word mask is there is because what we're doing is working with so many different layers, and through the actual process of manufacturing these chips, they are using a process called photolithography, and there's so many different masks that they have to use to show the different layers. So chain of going up in the role, I mean, there's senior level, principal level, and eventually, yeah, you can get to fellow or just subject matter expert within. And normally those positions are layout engineers that have some kind of PhD or just very long experience doing layout as well.
All right, so that actually is a great segue into the next topic, which is education requirements. And what I'm hearing is this is a role that can range from no college degree with some training. You still have to do some I don't even know if you call it certification. I'll let you use the words there for the program, like what they call that, graduate. Like you said, you're not an engineer, but you did go through some training. But then it goes all the way up to people who have PhDs could also be doing this job. So that's to me, a pretty big scope of people that can be in this field. And so what was that education you did go do?
The program in school was called Silicon Drafting Institute.
How long was that program for you?
I was really lucky because moving out to San Jose, I was able to stay with some family friends. And so I dedicated all my time to just going to school pretty much. I was able to finish the program within 4 months. So about half the time that it was required to normally finish the program. But to kind of touch on what you said, the coolest thing about the program that I went to was it was such a melting pot of so many different people coming from different career transitions like myself. And these are transitions from so many different industries, some that are not even engineering specific. And then you also had folks that did have their EE and would come in to specifically learn how to do layout. But there were folks from all over, folks within the States. There were some folks that had moved all the way from Vietnam or Taiwan, China, Korea, some folks in the Middle East, folks from Central America. It was just really interesting and awesome. We all, as a class, just really got close. And it's funny because there's always, every month, there's a new group of folks that come in. And so it does really feel like actual school with your classmates. It's a very great environment because we're all helping one another ultimately try and land a job and start a career. So, and the thing too with layout school in particular, to my knowledge, I want to say there's only 2 or 3 layout schools in the United States. And the school that I went to, SDI, is definitely the most well known, I would say.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because that's part of the point of this podcast, and is to try to expose people to what's possible. And when you hear somebody you hear the word semiconductor, to me, I don't know, but I feel like some people might just block it out altogether. But there's been a few roles where I've talked where people have been able to transition into some what might have been presumed like I could never do that roles. And it's like, no, there's ways to get into these industries. So I'm really glad the way you brought all the different backgrounds into what's possible here, like that mix of people that were in there. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. And one other thing that I just want to say too is like from the actual engineering perspective to the actual work that you do within layout, you could be a great engineer in terms of knowing like your knowledge on the theory aspect, but the actual job itself that you're doing every single day is layout. And so for those people that maybe find it difficult to learn something but are absolutely talented in doing an actual job that requires a skill, that I would totally recommend layout because you still get the component of learning something, but the most important thing that you're doing is your actual job, which is layout. And I think anybody could be good at layout, honestly.
Do you have any ongoing certifications that you have to make?
You're never necessarily going to be required to continue your education, but if you don't, there is a possibility in the future as things begin to become more automated that you need to specialize yourself within this industry. So right now, if we're talking like bleeding edge technology, FinFET is something that I think a lot of folks within the layout world want to be able to work on as well as learn about. But if you are just doing your job and not necessarily thinking about expanding your knowledge, especially at the rate of how quickly things change. A couple years ago, you could have been working on 10 nanometer device. Now you're working on a 2 nanometer device. The rules to the game are completely different. And it's really important to stay on top of these things. And sometimes specific companies aren't going to hold your hand through that process. It's something that you're going to have to learn on yourself. And there are resources out there to be able to learn these things. But I think more importantly, the layout community as a whole is great in terms of sharing knowledge with one another. And even though you might not know somebody that works at a specific company, it's great because everybody's always trying to kind of use groupthink to further expand each individual's knowledge. And I think that that's something that I really appreciate about this industry. I've talked to so many folks from different companies and members that have had much longer experiences than I have. And they don't mind sharing a little bit of their knowledge and letting me know, like, these are some of the things that I think you should keep up with or keep an eye out for.
I like the way you phrase that too. It's not required, but it's kind of an unwritten rule. You're going to be maintaining and keeping up some education. You're not just going to be able to learn it one and done and just execute for the next 30 years. It's probably not going to happen. So it's not required, but might be kind of hard to keep looking for jobs and keep yourself marketable if you're not doing it. Good perspective on that. On the PhD, master's, bachelor's coming through the SDI program, would you say there's any benefits to going the different routes?
I think from a management perspective, if you wanted to kind of climb company ranks and move into some type of management or executive position, then having master's and or a PhD is definitely, I wouldn't say a requirement, but it is very, very common because at that point, you're expected to be an absolute expert at the entire process of design. So from design to layout all the way to just the preliminary aspects of architecture as well. And when I say architecture, I mean, like, this is even before those first blueprints come out. You're just trying to figure out, this is the technology that we're using and this is what the customers want. How do we even get there? You need to have that high level of education to be able to effectively communicate with others and also just do the role.
And jumping into the job search, would you say most of these jobs are going to be on, I know they'll be on company websites. Like you said, Micron, they'll have a careers page. Apple will have a careers page. These jobs also pretty much on Indeed, LinkedIn. Is that pretty common? Or is there any special IC layout centric website, like where people wanted to go look just for those kind of jobs that's not part of the commonly known job search forums?
So you can definitely apply to jobs, any type of job posting site, LinkedIn, Indeed, Glassdoor. But I will say from my opinion as well as my experience, the best thing about these layout schools is, and for me, this is the number one reason that I was like, all right, I'm going to school, is companies directly hire from these schools. And like halfway through your curriculum, you'll start to receive some messages and emails from the administration about, hey, today we have AMD coming in, or hey, today Analog Bits or Micron is coming in looking to interview. And companies are now hiring from these schools just because the learning curve, I would say, for a student exiting university with just one course of layout is a lot higher than a person that has been at a layout school and knows how to just start right away, essentially. That's more beneficial for the company hiring. However, I don't want to say that it's not possible to get an entry level position without getting a direct hire from the school. I know that definitely is, but I would assume that it would be a lot more difficult. And just to continue on that a little bit, for those folks at my company that have electrical engineering degrees, it just so happens that the university and my company have a good relationship with each other. So electrical engineering, professors that also work at my company, there's the pipeline that goes on as well. I can't really necessarily speak for other companies and what type of pipeline that they have for recruiting talent, but just most of the individuals that I've met that have gone through layout school get directly hired at the school.
And I don't know if you're involved in hiring, but if you were, what would you be looking for someone during the interview with them?
I would just look for somebody that is great taking direction and also has an openness to learning. And most importantly, is a team player, is an individual that works well with others. Because, unless you're a contractor in this role and you're assigned a very minute task of getting something done on a very small scale, then at that point, you don't need to be communicating with others at all. You have your task, you have your job, you know what you're doing. But if you're looking to have a full-time position within this field, you definitely should know how to work with others and have an openness to wanting to learn and take on direction.
I think that's important too for people to hear. And I can't speak for all the other engineering roles, but for me, I do a lot of my work alone. I can be alone all day long and never talk to anybody sometimes. And I'm an electrical engineer. But for you, working also in the semiconductor industry, your role, you are interacting a lot. There is almost a requirement for what you're doing to be in sync and in tune with what's happening. And so I think it's important that people know that because for me, the assumption when I hear engineer, I hear introvert. I hear somebody just wants to like be in the books all day. They don't like to talk to people. They can be awkward. And these are just in my head some stereotypes. I don't know if that's like that out there everywhere, but you're the exact opposite of the stereotypes I just mentioned, which is great. On the home stretch, talk about income a little bit, and then we'll move into kind of the parting words and career advice and anything else you'd like to add after that.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk about this. So from an entry level perspective, normally companies are hiring between the ranges of like 60,000 to 90,000. That would normally be your entry level range. And from that point on, it really just comes down to for actual layout. If you can expand your skills and you work on specific skills that could get you higher paying roles, that's something that you should definitely try and learn. For example, within, IC layout, being able to have the skill of doing analog or custom work is extremely crucial. And there are going to be companies that pay extremely high salaries, or a lot of the work within this industry is also hourly, which is great too if you have to work overtime just from a financial perspective.
When you say high salaries, like you probably have some perspectives in mind, but for somebody listening who really has nowhere to like, what does high mean? Do you mean like in the two to 300s, up to 500 or over 500 plus when you talk about these customs roles that you could get into, like with specialized skill sets? Do you have any idea like where those ranges fall into?
Yeah. So just to go back, entry level, 60 to 90. And then once you get into your E2 level, it really depends on the company that you're at. That could range anywhere between, 100 to 200,000. And once you get into your specific high level skills like custom circuit, custom work, analog, FinFET, RF, then you're potentially looking anywhere between 200 to 300,000. And this isn't without like a degree, you don't need electrical engineering degree to be able to make a great salary like that. But what you do need is a high level of layout skill and just dedication to learning more, because once you get up to that band of salary, the work itself gets extremely, extremely complex and almost sometimes a little infinitely more challenging because there's so many different design rules and so many different just problems that arise when you're working with such small spaces. So I would say that. And then if you're ever looking to get into a layout manager role, your salary is always going to be higher than the people that are under you. So, but for those roles, that's when you have to have some kind of master's or a PhD, perhaps.
Right now, out of all the interviews I've done, talking with you, this is probably the fastest ramp up time educationally, snagging a job, and financially.
It sounds too good to be true.
Yeah. It's like there's this little hidden gem out there.
Yeah.
Within a year, you got people coming to you for jobs. You got these partnerships. Like you're not even really hitting the streets, so to speak. You got people coming to you looking to hire you. So that's pretty amazing.
And I also don't want to like just paint it, with rose-colored glasses. Kind of what you had mentioned earlier. The industry itself is very cyclical, and so you may enter into a hot job market, or right now, for example, the market to get a job is a little more difficult than it was a few years ago. And so that's just also something to consider as well. But once you're able to get your foot in the door, that's when things start really moving. And it's just very exciting to be able to have that type of trajectory potentially.
I guess before I go into the advice section, you brought up AI earlier. There's a big question. Is AI going to take my job?
Yeah, I mean it's really tough to say because we have a lot of tools that help us. That's a form of automation. It definitely makes our jobs quicker, more efficient. And those new tools will continue to come out. And so that's why it's extremely important to be able to kind of differentiate yourself with those skills. Can I be able to do something that AI cannot? And that really comes down to your creativity, because that is a very important aspect of this career. And maybe it's a little bit too optimistic of me and the other folks that I talk to about these things, but for AI to completely do the job of a layout designer, I mean, that would have to take some serious engineering and just automation technology. I don't know necessarily how that could be done because there are so many intricacies and detail work that you have to be able to do. And also to replicate creativity is very difficult. And so always make sure you are, expanding your knowledge within this industry, learn the latest technologies, be able to talk to designers to also understand theory more. Most importantly, keep that creative spark and desire to just want to have fun. Like it's a very fun job. I feel very lucky and blessed. And as long as you have that spirit going about, then you're able to move forward in this career and maintain it.
It sounds like you're kind of giving some great advice there. But do you have any career advice to give people, or any motivational words you'd like to leave with the listeners before we wrap it up?
I would say within this role in particular, so for any listeners out there that eventually are transitioning into wanting to do IC layout, and once you do get your foot in the door, I would say, the world is kind of your oyster at that point. You'll have a lot of opportunities because there's so many different type of companies out there. You'll have your big companies, your medium-sized companies, all the way to your startups. And each of them have a specific vision on how they want to do their work, as well as what their belief on layout is. My biggest advice is don't try and limit yourself, even if the pay is really good. Always try and put yourself in a challenging position to grow and learn, because you never know when certain things like automation can catch up. Also, a more skilled or talented individual. So it's just important to be able to be in an environment where you feel like you can continue to grow. If that is how you can approach it, the sky's the limit. Also, this is not necessarily for my career, but just from my personal perspective. I'm about to turn 29 in a few weeks. And I think I'm really happy that I found this podcast because particularly for a lot of people within my generation or even Gen Z, I consider myself as millennial. So right in between the millennials and Gen Z. I think our entire life, we're kind of taught, hey, you're going to go to high school, go to college, pick your major, get your 4 years in, maybe intern. And these are kind of the jobs and careers that you're limited to from a more broad perspective. But I think, with like a podcast like this is really helpful because if you're out there and you're thinking about a career one day, maybe think a little bit outside of the box and find specific careers that could spark an interest or a desire that you may have that you might not necessarily get from just being in school all day. Like when I was in university, I never had time to think about whether or not I wanted to go to law school. I was so steep in textbooks that by the time school had ended, I was like, oh man, this isn't what I actually wanted to do. And so don't feel like your career path is in a rush to get started right away. You have a lot of time. Everything is going to be okay. Keep that self-belief up. Just affirm to yourself that you're going to do wonderful things. And as long as you have that mindset, it's going to take you really far. And most importantly, just be a good human being. That will get you really far in life.
I can't think of any better words to end with than that. So I'll say that's a wrap, and we can wrap it up if you don't have anything else you'd like to add or any questions before we drop off.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you so much.
If you like what you hear and want to take the next steps in exploring your career after listening to an episode, go to JobGuppy.com to see a summary and helpful links to things mentioned during the interview, like industry-specific forums or websites, example job searches, career ladders, and degree programs or trade school recommendations. The hope is you now have more information than you did before from the guest on the podcast to help you move forward with the next steps on your career exploration journey. Tune in each week as JobGuppy continues to explore a million jobs in the sea.